What happened when my husband's family kept forgetting to include me in everything? Holidays, group chats, even the birth of my own niece, and I decided to teach them exactly what being invisible really looks like. The first time it happened, I told myself it was a mistake. The second time, I called it a misunderstanding. By the fifth time, I started to understand exactly what it was. I married into a family that didn't want me there. At first, they were polite about it, the kind of distant, smile-too-long politeness that hides contempt like lipstick hides a bruise. My husband, Eli, came from one of those families that still believes wives are meant to orbit their men's lives, not live inside them. His mother, Judith, was the queen of that orbit, hosting every holiday, every dinner, every decision, and expecting everyone else to fall in line. When Eli proposed, Judith congratulated him with a smile that never reached her eyes and said, "I just hope she knows what she's getting into. I should have paid attention to that tone." At first, I tried to fit in. I baked pies for Thanksgiving. I offered to help clean up after family dinners. I laughed at inside jokes I didn't understand. They tolerated me, barely. Every time we left one of their dinners, Eli would say, "You worry too much. My mom likes you." But I'd seen her text once, when his phone lit up on the counter during breakfast. "She's nice enough, but she doesn't really fit in with us." Us. The invisible border between family and me. It got worse after our wedding. They started a family group chat without me. I only found out because Eli's phone kept pinging while we were watching a movie. "Who's that?" I asked. "Oh, just my family," he said. "Can I see?" He hesitated for half a second, too long. There it was. A thread of messages from his mom, his sister, and his cousins. Holiday plans, photos, jokes, memes, all the things they posted on Facebook later, pretending they'd forgotten to tag me. When I asked him why I wasn't included, he said, "It's just easier. They talk about stuff from years ago. You'd be bored." Right, because being excluded is so much less boring. The final straw came 6 months later, when his sister Mara gave birth. I didn't even know she was in labor. We were at brunch when Eli's phone rang. His face lit up. "Mom says the baby's here." He jumped up, grabbed his keys. I blinked. "Wait, what? She had the baby?" He nodded. "Yeah, let's go." But when we got to the hospital, Judith was waiting outside the maternity ward. "Oh," she said, her smile too sharp. "We already visited. Only family is allowed inside right now." I stood there, stunned. "I'm her sister-in-law." "Yes," she said sweetly, "but she's still recovering. Maybe next time." Then she turned to Eli. "Come in, honey." And he went. He actually went. I stood there alone in a hallway that smelled like antiseptic and betrayal, watching him disappear behind a door labeled family only. That was the moment something inside me went quiet. Not angry, just still. Because I realized something. If they were going to treat me like I didn't exist, I could return the favor. Only better, smarter, cleaner. Wasn't going to yell or beg for inclusion anymore. I was going to make my absence the loudest thing they'd ever hear. The quiet I chose was not dramatic. It wasn't a viral post or a slammed door. It was a set of small, implacable decisions. The kind that look like everyday self-respect if you don't watch closely enough. I mapped their ecosystem. What I did that no one noticed. Where my labor filled the cracks they pretended didn't exist. Then I stopped whoring. First, I stopped answering the family group chat. Not a dramatic mute, just nothing. The pings came, the gossip trundled along, and I let it pile into the blue bubble that lived in my husband's phone. Eli's face would twitch when a new message lit up during dinner, and for the first week I watched him click and not respond. He was learning the feeling of having to choose where to put his attention. It made him tense. Good. Second, I stopped playing logistics. You'd be amazed at how many family operations hinge on one person who just keeps track. Who's bringing pie? Which room Aunt Joan is allergic to? Who can pick up the cake? That person had been me for years. I let the spreadsheet become their problem. When a cousin asked, "Julia, can you bring the cheese plate?" I said, "I won't be at Thanksgiving." No negotiation, no smiley face. The silence that followed was heavy enough to cut. Third, I reclaimed my time. I politely and then not so politely declined the "help me with decorations" texts. When Judith sent a passive-aggressive email about needing extra hands this year, I replied with a calendar invite, blocking off the entire weekend for work, family boundary. I labeled it. I made the absence visible on purpose. If I was going to be invisible, I would be a visible absence. They noticed slowly, like people notice when a slow leak finally bursts a pipe. The first week, it was little things. A casserole left unbrought, a hall closet nobody had a key for now because I hadn't been the one to hide the spare. Someone had to make last-minute runs to the store. Someone stood awkwardly in the kitchen holding tin foil while the oven cooled. The second week, Mara texted Eli, "Is Julia okay? She hasn't replied to my story." Eli's discomfort widened until it was a bruise behind his eyes. At home, I made other changes. I'd stopped making plans that revolved around them. No more spontaneous, "we'll just pop over afternoons." Instead, I started booking things that made me slightly unavailable in the softest way possible. A pottery class on Thursdays, a weekend hiking trip with friends, a monthly writer's night. It was a small recalibration of priorities, but when Judith called to ask why I hadn't RSVP'd for the family movie night, Eli had to say, "She's got plans." He sounded oddly proud, like he was trying on an unfamiliar suit. My strategy was not to punish by pettiness, but to expose a truth they'd worked hard to ignore. They liked the product of my presence better than the person who produced it. They relied on me to remember birthdays, to hand out dishes, to smooth family tensions. Without me, their performative competence faltered. They had always advertised themselves as a seamless, close unit. Without the woman who accepted the role of invisible assistant, the seams showed. There were other small experiments. I stopped hosting holiday dinners at our place. For years, I'd been the one to sanitize table settings, plan menus, and patch fights with extra wine. Instead, I started hosting two-person rituals that included Eli and me, sometimes our friends. The first time I cooked a small, quiet dinner without the extended family present. Judith called the next day to ask why the house hadn't been available. Friendly probing. I told her honestly, I wanted a night in. Her voice tightened. Something like disbelief that a grown grown woman could simply rest. What shocked me wasn't that they noticed, it was how unpracticed they were at managing the friction my absence created. People think exclusion is simply refusing to let someone in. The harder, truer test is watching what happens when the excluded person actually stops doing the unseen work that lubricates social life. Suddenly, there were double bookings, hurt feelings that had nothing to do with the dispute, but everything to do with logistics, and the irritable realization that the family's traditions were, in many cases, habits sustained by my willingness to fill in. At Eli's office, someone forwarded me a screenshot from Judith's chat that read, "Can someone remind Julia that we're doing the mashed potatoes? She always brings them." The tone wasn't malicious. It was a casual expectation. I printed it and stuck it on the fridge. Every night I walked past it and felt my spine lengthen. There was a social cost. Friends wondered why I wasn't at the big holiday brunches. Coworkers asked where I was when a family event featured me in the background of 50 vacation photos that were posted online. A few people actually said, "It seems like you and Eli haven't been doing much together lately," in the sort of tone that assumes trouble. I didn't correct them. I refused to perform panic. The less spectacle, the more the absence said, "This is deliberate." Eli's resistance arrived in small waves. He would come home and catch me mid-note as I declined another invitation. "Is this a stunt?" he asked once, exasperated. "Are you trying to make a point?" I looked up from the vase I was rearranging and said, "I'm doing my work outside your family's approval." He sat down, running a hand over his face. There was genuine confusion there. Not malice, just the dawning realization that decades of habit had taught him what role to play, and not how to think about who actually fills it. The first time Judith tried to gaslight me directly, I was ready. She called after Mara's baby shower, voice honey-laced as always. "Oh, we had a lovely morning. You would have loved seeing the floral arrangement, Julia," she said, emphasizing my name like it was a brand of marmalade. She already knew I hadn't been invited. It was performative cruelty. I answered the way a person who'd stopped performing answers. "I'm glad it was nice." No pleading, no protest. Just the truth. I was glad for them. She then tried a different tack, the erasure by omission. Family photos were posted as if I'd never been present. Siblings arm in arm, Mara breastfeeding the baby with no sister-in-law in sight. The comments poured in with delighted emojis. Someone messaged Eli, "Why didn't Julia come?" "We missed her," he replied. "She had plans." The questions circled like flies. They started to scramble in other ways. For one holiday, a cousin discovered deep cleaning the guest room wasn't as easy as I made it look. For another party, someone complained that the playlist had been a little tone-deaf. Minor problems, but dozens of them. Friction points that had always been smoothed out by a woman whose contribution no one named. Watching them make a list of things that suddenly required attention felt like watching a house lose power, and then realize no one knew how to fix the circuit breaker. My absence also encouraged some people to step up. A few of Eli's cousins were mortified by the logistical hiccups and apologized privately, acknowledging things they'd always expected me to absorb. One of them messaged, "I had no idea how much you did. I'm sorry." Those apologies were honest and they mattered. But apologies don't equal inclusion. There's a difference between recognizing labor and admitting a person into a family's inner life. The first real tremor came when Mara posted an awkward 3-hour slideshow of her newborn's first week on Facebook, a stream of perfectly lit nursery shots, but the caption included a strangely formal line. "Thank you to everyone who supported us. We were so glad to have family." The phrasing felt engineered, public. People were trying to reassert the family's narrative. A few comments tried to thread the needle. Others made obvious assumptions. I watched from the edge of the internet, feeling oddly like a curator at an exhibit of my own erasure. When Eli came home that night, the tension between us was an unfurled map. He sat at the kitchen island and ran his hands through his hair. "Do you think I handled the hospital wrong?" he asked. "I should have done more." His voice carried the faint whine of someone learning accountability for the first time. I felt a stab of something like pity, then something colder. I told him plainly, "You walked into a room that had a door marked family, and you believed the sign. You didn't ask why it was there. That's on us both." That night we argued, badly and finally. He said he'd assumed being sent back was the family setting. I said he'd assumed he could have it both ways. A wife at home and a mother who got first priority. We both said things we couldn't unsay, but the argument cleared one fog. He knew where I stood. For the first time, inclusion wasn't something to ask for. It was something to negotiate. The weeks that followed were not a grand resolution. They were a series of small reckonings. Judith's forced phone call after a missed holiday, Eli's knitting together of small apologies that were awkwardly real. He began, haltingly, to bring up times when his family's tradition had actually been a habit built around someone else's labor. He started to ask me, "What would you like?" and then looked surprised when I answered. It didn't make Judith melt into contrition. Her reactions hardened sometimes. Other times, she swallowed her pride and made a clumsy reach. People are complicated, but the absence I'd created no longer felt vengeful in my chest. It felt like an experiment in visibility. When you make your own presence scarce, you give people a chance to notice what they're missing. Some will, some won't. By the time Mara's baby turned 6 months old, Judith had sent a short formal invitation for a small Sunday luncheon, this time explicitly including me. The message read like a contract. "We would like you to join us as family." It was awkward and late and required a decision. I looked at Eli, who was quietly examining his hands like a man who'd learned responsibility. I could have said yes. I could have given them the family they'd finally offered. Instead, I accepted on my own terms. I RSVP'd that I would come, and I wrote beneath it, "I'll bring dessert and would like to help with tidying up afterwards. Please include details of when I'll be expected so we can coordinate." It was a small line, practical, but it repositioned me from automatic helper to negotiated contributor. They were flustered by the request. Judith texted back with a string of cautious thumbs-up emojis. The luncheon itself was ordinary and small, and in ways that mattered, different. They had to plan. They had to to allocate tasks, they had to acknowledge my role. The day wasn't perfect. Bits of old tension surfaced. A comment here, a look there, but there were also tiny, human moments I'd wanted all along. Mara thanking me sincerely for bringing the right cup in a tone I'd never heard her use before. Eli taking my hand at the table, not as a performance, but as a steady presence. I didn't win anything that afternoon except one thing that mattered. I was not invisible. And for someone who had made a life of smoothing other people's edges, to be seen was a rarer victory than any dramatic exit. There were consequences, of course. Judith would never be my closest ally. Some bridges remained burned. But these are the trade-offs you make when you stop being the unseen engine. You either compel the machine to show its parts, or you leave it to whir on without you. On the drive home, Eli reached over and slid his hand into mine. "I'm sorry," he said simply. No speeches, no apologies dressed in resentment. Just a small, genuine admission that he'd been complacent. I squeezed his fingers and let the quiet answer him. That night, I slept without the tightness that had lived under my ribs for months. Not because families change overnight, but because when you insist on your existence, the world has to take some kind of measure. The absence that had been my protest had become an invitation to notice, to acknowledge, to negotiate a new role, one with boundaries and names. And that was the point. I wanted them to understand that being family wasn't a given for me. It was something you did, not a word you printed on a card. The weeks after the luncheon felt like the first days after a storm, when you walk the property and count what didn't wash away. Some things were intact. A cousin still sent me recipes, a neighbor waved when I watered the plants, and some things were irrevocably shifted. Judith's invitations were now explicit. She stopped assuming my presence like a background prop, which, in a way, was the point. Assumptions don't count unless you name them, but people don't change habits overnight. They blunder, and families, stubborn and sentimental, are particularly bad at graceful adjustments. One Sunday in late autumn, the family gathered for Eli's grandfather's 80th birthday. It was the sort of event Judith loved. Rehearsed to the inch, speeches printed on nice cardstock, a slideshow of black and white photos that made the room sniffle politely. I accepted the invitation because I wanted to see the truth of this new arrangement up close. I wanted to measure whether absence had become respect, or whether we'd merely papered over the same old architecture of erasure. From the beginning, the day hummed with a familiar choreography. Cousins comparing shoes, aunties trading dietary notes. The men clustered politely off to one side, where they pretended to discuss investments. Judith had given Eli a role, introduced the cake, and given me the role of guest. It felt cleaner than the old dynamic, but when the first round of speeches started, I noticed the way someone kept checking my seat. Not because it was empty, because when I'd been the background engine, that seat had been the engine room. The family realized it now, but realization isn't the same thing as gratitude. After the dessert course, Grandpa felt faint. He'd stood too quickly to accept a toast, and his eyes rolled back a fraction. For a second, everything slowed. A napkin dropped, a glass tipped, air turned viscous, which is to say, the moment you learn how much someone did is often precisely the moment you truly need them. A cousin rushed for water. Someone else grabbed a chair. Judith hovered, static and pale, calling for the phone like an eraser that couldn't quite smooth the panic. People looked to her to fix it, because in her scripts, she's the one who announces problems and hands out solutions. But the phone was in her purse beneath a pile of meticulously folded programs. Her hands trembled as she dug. She was, in that sharp human moment, ordinary and unpracticed. I moved because I had moved for them so many times before without notice. I grabbed the phone, dialed the doctor on speed dial, checked Grandpa's pulse, told someone to call 911 and someone else to bring the car keys. The household that had prided itself on seamlessness suddenly traded its costume for bare hands, and then watched me put my gloves on. It's strange how quickly dependency rearranges the room. The cousin who'd joked about not wanting to clean up after Julia was now on his knees checking for a pulse. Judith's composure cracked in a small human way. "We should have had someone at the party desk who knows where the addresses are," she said, voice thin. It was the small, practical admission that has the sound of a key turning. The paramedics came. Grandpa stabilized. In between the antiseptic and the humming of the stretcher wheels, people kept saying, like incantation, "Thank you." Not the thin social thanks that had once been the family's currency, but an honest, raw kind. Judith's hand found mine for a beat as they loaded Grandpa into the ambulance. Not the cold grip of entitlement, but the slightly shaking hold of someone who realizes the fabric of her hearth had a seam she hadn't stitched. That night at the hospital, while forms were filled and 2-5 explanations given, something shifted in them more than any speech or meeting could have forced. Judith sat with her head in her hands and then, without theatrics, turned to me. "I didn't think about logistics when I was planning the party," she said. "I assumed it all worked because it always did. There was no asterisk, no excuse. Just the admission. For once, it landed like a hard, useful thing." Eli's change was quieter, more resolute. He had been rattled the first week after the family-only door, mind spinning with the small betrayals that had built his default. But here, watching me work, he stopped being the man who thought in habits and started being the man who knew names. He sat with Grandpa in the hospital corridor and squeezed my hand when I needed it. A small solidarity that felt like choosing a different map. He later told me, apologetic and honest, "I thought I was honoring tradition. I see now I was honoring convenience." The sentence had cost him something, and you could see the ledger balancing in the way he held himself. The aftermath didn't make everything golden. Judith apologized privately, the kind of apology that doesn't demand forgiveness but asks for it. She invited me to help plan a recovery dinner, and true to the new terms, I negotiated. I wanted to be credited for catering choices. I wanted a list of tasks up front, explicit roles, not assumptions. She acquiesced because the alternative was admitting she'd been outsourcing emotional labor without saying it, and in that small surrender, something like mutual respect took root. But not everyone in the orbit joined the truce. A set of cousins grumbled about about new rules, about being policed. They use the old word, sensitive, as if boundaries were a kind of sniffy disease. A handful of friends on the edges of our lives stopped inviting us over. They said conversationally, we don't want to get involved. Their disinterest was a cost. When you lift the curtain, some people prefer the theater. The real work, beyond the hospital night, was translating those long-term changes into habit. So I kept with the small rituals that had made my absence visible in the first place. I continued to host my Thursday pottery night. I still declined last-minute requests with a firm calendar block. I kept the work-family boundary weekend on my shared calendar, but I also started running small workshops in the kitchen for the younger cousins. Not lessons about cooking, but about logistics, how to coordinate dates, how to divide tasks so no single person becomes the invisible engine. I framed them as practical life skills, and because people love to learn without being accused of failing, they came. Watching a young cousin godsend a spreadsheet that actually worked was quietly satisfying. They learned to ask before assuming. They learned to name labor. Eli began to proactively ask me in front of his family, Julia, what works for you? Not as a one-off, but as a template. He would call Judith and say, when we host, I'll take X. Julia will take Y. The sentence, innocuous on its face, rearranged conversation. It stopped being the default choreography where women in the background read cues. It became a negotiation. Judith never became my friend in the way I'd once hoped. She's a woman who built her identity around being indispensable in a very particular way. Not for marshalling tasks, but for being the center of meaning for her family. That center, when she realized it was partially dependent on people like me doing the invisible work, softened for a while, and then hardened sometimes when old habits felt safer. There were setbacks. A holiday where she almost reverted. The messages slipped back into, you'll handle the list tone. Forced a candid conversation. I told her plainly that I would be present on my terms, and that if she needed someone to run the show automatically, she'd have to hire someone. It was not a threat, only a fact. She made an awkward joke about resale value, and then signed up for a list of responsibilities. She even thanked me at a small family meeting properly, in front of a handful of relatives. We appreciate the things you do, she said, and I'm sorry I didn't notice. The apology didn't wipe the past, but it opened a small, honest ledger for the future. The change was incremental and sometimes terrifying. When you stop being the person who silently absorbs labor, the world asks you to assert and negotiate in ways that expose you. You might be called selfish or divisive. You will lose people who'd rather the machinery run than pay for it. I lost some social ease. I gained self-respect. One evening, months later, Eli and I sat on the back porch with coffee and the thin hush of a household settling down. He said, do you regret making it a thing? He asked it in the soft, honest voice of someone who feared he might have cost them more than he intended. I thought about the hospital hall, about Grandpa's small hand gripping mine as we loaded him into the ambulance, about Judith's face when she finally asked for help. I thought about the young cousins who were learning to coordinate without defaulting to a woman who always said yes. I thought about the quiet dinners I'd started having with friends who loved me for me, and the pottery class that filled my weeks in an unpressured way. No, I said, I don't regret it. I regret that it took so long for them to see what they'd lost, but I don't regret my part in asking them to notice. He reached for my hand. Thank you, he said, simple and true. There is no neat moral where everyone becomes noble. Family is messy and stubborn. Judith still left things off lists sometimes. She still forgot to ask. Sometimes I'm tired of negotiating. There are days when I yearn for the old easy invisibility because it was less complicated, but those are the same days I remember why I stopped being small. The hardest, most honest victory is not changing other people instantly. It's changing the contract of your life so you don't answer to invisible rules anymore. The house still hums with old songs, and I still scrub a sink here and there. But now when I do, it's because I chose it. And when I don't, no one can pretend it was a misstep. They must account for the frayed seams and either learn to repair them or learn to live with a draft. That realization, practical and unpoetic, is the kind of piece you can hang your life on. It's not a shout. It's a rearrangement of daily gravity. And because of it, the family that forgot me now has to remember, or live with the consequences of their forgetting. By the time spring rolled around, the balance in the family had shifted in ways even I hadn't expected. I had stopped being a background character in their narrative, and they had stopped being the center of mine. But change, even when earned, doesn't arrive gently. It tests your endurance. It makes you decide whether the person you've become can coexist with the ghosts of who you were. The first big test came in April. During Easter weekend, Judith called Eli on speakerphone while we were making breakfast. Her voice carried that same brittle sweetness I'd learned to recognize as a warning. Eli, honey, I hope you and your wife are planning to come for Easter lunch, she said, emphasizing your wife the way some people emphasize the problem. Eli looked at me. I shrugged. I'll have to check with Julia, he said. We already made plans that day. Silence on the line, the kind that crackles with offense. Well, Judith said finally, I just assumed you'd want to spend the day with family. He didn't flinch. Julia is my family. It was such a small sentence, but it landed like thunder. For years, I had waited for him to say that without guilt or hesitation. And when he finally did, I didn't feel vindicated. I felt peaceful. We didn't go to that Easter lunch. Instead, we hosted our own. A few friends, some neighbors, a couple from my pottery class. It was relaxed and perfect, warm, and no one felt like an outsider. Later that evening, when I posted a photo of the dinner table, just laughter, mismatched chairs, the cat asleep near the window, Judith commented, looks cozy. Glad you found something to do. It should have stung, but it didn't, because that wasn't a wound anymore. That was a line from an old script, delivered by an actress who didn't realize the play had ended. A few weeks later, the family announced that Grandpa's health had declined again. Eli wanted to visit, and I told him to go. I didn't want my pride to keep him from his grandfather. But then, the night before the visit, Judith texted him, maybe just you this this time. He's tired. It's easier with fewer people. Eli read it out loud, and I saw the anger flash across his face. Not at me, but at her. He typed back, Julia's coming. She was there when he needed us last time. If that's a problem, we'll both stay home. She didn't reply. When we arrived the next morning, Judith opened the door, her expression tight, but Grandpa's face lit up when he saw me. There's my nurse, he said, smiling. How's my favorite girl? Judith's mouth twitched, but she didn't say a word. We spent the afternoon helping him sort old photos. Judith hovered in the kitchen, awkward, silent. Every so often, I caught her watching me, not with malice, with curiosity, like she was trying to figure out what she had miscalculated. When we left, she stopped us at the door. Julia, she said slowly, thank you for coming. Her tone was uneven, like the words didn't quite fit her mouth yet. I nodded. Of course. He's family. Something flickered across her face. Realization, maybe. Or 3-5, regret. 2 months later, she called again. Not Eli this time, me. It was a Tuesday morning. Julia, she said, voice oddly soft. I'm planning Mara's birthday dinner. I'd like your help. I almost laughed. The same woman who'd once said I didn't fit in was now asking for help planning the event she'd excluded me from 2 years ago. What kind of help? I asked. Just, well, you're good at making things run smoothly. I thought maybe we could do it together. It was tempting to say no, to remind her of all the times she'd done things without me, but I could hear something in her tone. Not manipulation this time, but the quiet, clumsy humility of someone learning a new language. So I said, sure, but I'll need the full guest list, tasks divided equally, and no last-minute surprises. She agreed immediately. The dinner went surprisingly well. We cooked side by side in the kitchen. For the first half hour, we barely spoke, just moved around each other, setting tables and chopping vegetables like cautious allies. Then, halfway through, she said, you know, Eli seems happier lately. I looked up. Yeah, I think so. She hesitated. You've made him stronger. I don't think I ever taught him how to stand up for someone. I froze, because that, right there, was the first real compliment she'd ever given me. After dinner, as guests trickled out, Judith turned to me. I used to think inclusion was about control, about keeping people close enough to manage. You taught me that it's actually about trust. I didn't have an answer for that. I just said, it's about honesty. She nodded. I'm learning. And for once, I believed her. Later that night, when Eli and I were back home, I sat by the window, watching the city lights blink like quiet applause. He came up behind me, resting his hands on my shoulders. You did it, he said. Did what? You didn't just make them see you. You made them see themselves. I smiled, tired but content. Maybe that's what it takes. Sometimes you have to disappear to make people look up. Months passed. The family dynamic settled into something steady. Not perfect, not healed, but real. Judith no longer called me his wife in that pointed way. Mara started asking for my opinion on things. They even added me to the group chat. The first message I got from it said, hey Julia, could you send that amazing cheesecake recipe from the birthday dinner? I did, but I didn't stay in the chat long. I muted it after a while, not out of resentment, but out of peace, because I didn't need their constant validation anymore. I had learned something far more important, that the power I once thought I needed from their approval was already mine. It had just been buried under years of being polite. A few nights later, I got a message from Judith. You were right. It's not about control. It's about respect. Thank you for teaching me that, even when I didn't deserve it. I typed back one line. We all learn when we're ready. Then I turned off my phone, leaned against Eli, and watched the quiet city outside our window. For the first time since marrying into that family, I didn't feel like I had to prove my place. I just existed, and that was enough. 5 years later, I stood in the same kitchen that once felt like enemy territory, stirring soup while Judith sat at the table sorting photos for a family album. The afternoon light cut through the curtains, soft and forgiving. The hum of the house had changed. It wasn't the sound of performance anymore. It was the quiet, real rhythm of people who'd finally stopped pretending. Judith's hands had slowed since her surgery. She liked to sit near the window where she could see the magnolia tree bloom, the one I'd planted the year after the Great Silence, as she now called it. She said it reminded her of patience, how it takes years for roots to go deep enough to hold their own. That afternoon, she asked, do you ever think about how far we've come? I smiled. Every time I walk through that door, she chuckled. It's funny, isn't it? The door didn't change. We did. She was right. It hadn't been instant. None of it was. After Mara's birthday dinner, there were still stumbles. Judith sometimes slipped back into her old tone, soft as sugar and twice as controlling. I still caught myself waiting for permission I no longer needed. But little by little, the dynamic shifted. Eli learned how to hold boundaries without turning them into walls. Judith learned how to ask instead of assume. Mara learned how to apologize without turning it into a spectacle. And me? I learned how to live without needing to prove I belonged. The real change didn't reveal itself until the next generation came along. Mara's daughter, Lily, the same baby I wasn't allowed to meet at the hospital, was now 5 years old and as wild and curious as the firework. One afternoon, she was drawing in the living room while the adults talked. When she finished, she ran over to Judith and held up her masterpiece, a messy crayon family portrait. Judith gasped, oh, sweetheart, that's beautiful. Who's this one? Lily pointed. That's Grandma. That's Mommy. That's Uncle Eli. And that's Aunt Julia. Judith blinked. Aunt Julia? Uh-huh, Lily said confidently. She's part of the family. There was a long silence. Then Judith said, her voice softer than I'd ever heard it. Yes, she is. She looked at me as she said it. It wasn't performative. It wasn't even an apology. It was a correction, a rewriting of the story in real time, spoken by the one person who'd once refused to give me a title at all. That single sentence, yes, she is, was more than any grand gesture, because it came from the same mouth that had once kept me outside hospital doors. After that, Judith started calling me her daughter-in-law with something that almost sounded like pride. She even introduced me to her friends that way, adding small, awkward anecdotes like, she's the one who taught us how to actually talk to each other instead of just throwing casseroles at problems. Her friends would laugh, but she meant it. Eli, for his part, grew into into a version of himself I think neither of us expected. Thoughtful, self-aware, proud to stand with me, not in front of me. He started therapy on his own. One night, over dinner, he said, "I think my mom raised me to be loved by people who served, not by people who demanded to be seen. And you broke that." I told him, "No, we broke it together." He smiled. "Either way, I'm grateful you didn't give up on me when it was easier to leave." Years passed, quietly, the way healed things often do. Judith's health declined, but her humility grew sharper. She started journaling, something her old self would have called self-indulgent. In one of those journals, she wrote me a letter I didn't find until after she died. It said, "Julia, I used to think you were trying to take my son away. I see now you were trying to give him back to himself. I used to think you wanted control. You wanted peace. I used to think silence meant winning. But silence when chosen is wisdom. Thank you for teaching me that. I'm sorry it took me this long to understand." It was signed with love. Not sincerely. Not best wishes. Just love. After Judith's funeral, Mara pulled me aside. "I need you to know something," she said. "When Mom was in the hospital, she told me her biggest regret wasn't how she treated you. It was how she taught me to treat people like you." I felt my throat close up. She said, Mara continued, "Julia wasn't trying to join us. She was trying to show us how to include others. I mistook leadership for threat." That night, Mara added me as co-admin to the family group chat. No fanfare, no announcement, just quiet acknowledgement. The years kept moving. The magnolia tree out front grew tall enough to throw shade across the driveway. Lily grew into a bright teenager who'd rather spend afternoons baking with me than scrolling through her phone. Sometimes, she'd ask about the past, not out of gossip, but out of curiosity. "Why didn't Grandma like you at first?" she asked once, licking frosting off her finger. I smiled. She didn't know how to like someone who didn't play by her rules. Did you forgive her? I thought about that for a moment. "I think we forgave each other," I said. "Forgiveness isn't saying what happened was okay. It's deciding it doesn't get to own you anymore." She nodded thoughtfully, as if tucking the lesson away. Now, every year on Easter, the holiday that used to divide us, I host the whole family. It's a tradition now, though not the kind built on guilt or obligation. Everyone brings something. Everyone helps. The table isn't perfect. It never is, but it's real. Before we eat, we go around and say what we're thankful for. This year, Mara went first. "I'm thankful for my sister-in-law," she said, looking at me with a smile, "for teaching us that boundaries can build bridges, not walls." Eli squeezed my hand under the table. When it was my turn, I said, "I'm thankful for second chances, for people who learn, for families that grow up as much as they grow old." Judith's chair was empty now, but the magnolia bloomed in the yard like an old promise finally kept. Later that night, as the dishes soaked and the laughter faded, I stepped outside. The air smelled like spring, wet earth, and new beginnings. I looked at that magnolia tree, remembering the woman I was the day I planted it, angry, unseen, ready to burn everything down just to be noticed. Now, I didn't need to be noticed. I was known, and that, I realized, was 4-5, what I'd been fighting for all along. Because sometimes the loudest rebellion isn't leaving, it's staying and refusing to disappear. The end 5-5.